Welcome back to the final episode in the series dealing with Queen Elizabeth I as the Great Queen, as outlined in Will Durant's book, The Age of Reason Begins, which is volume 7 in his story of civilization. I need to begin with some, unfortunately, bad news that affects a lot of the future of this series. In case you didn't hear, Queen Elizabeth I has passed away. It happened. 1603. And that's the focus of Will Durant's 11th section in this first chapter. And he calls it The Magic Fades, years 1601 to 1603. Now, you would expect that I'm going to give a nice glowing review of Queen Elizabeth I's reign. I'm not. I'm actually going to throw her under the bus. So this is probably going to be my most raw and direct video. And I'm going to preface this by again stating that I am not a professional historian. I'm not even qualified to be an amateur historian. I'm just a person who is reading through this series in a quest to understand the world that I live in and where modern life evolved from based on things that have happened in the past. Before I get to Queen Elizabeth, I want to chat briefly about historical bias. The second thing that I want to do is to evaluate the reign of Queen Elizabeth I in light of a framework of effective leadership. And I will actually grade her on 5 major categories. Now, I was a professor for nearly 20 years at Indiana University, at Purdue University, and at a couple others. I have not issued grades in several years. I do photography and videography full time. I help organizations tell their stories instead of students. But nonetheless, I'm going to return to the grading scale for this one-time event, although I might do it with other leaders in the future. But first, let's just chat briefly about historical bias. History majors probably take a course called historiography. I believe that's how it's termed. And it's basically the science of approaching the study of history. How do you go about actually doing it? In my case, I'm concerned as a consumer with how do I actually read the stuff that's produced, because I wasn't there in the 1600s. I am completely dependent, for the most part, on the research of historians. If I had the time and the budget, I could go over and at least look at the ruins of places and artifacts, but still, that doesn't really tell me the story unless I have access to all those documents. We look at history through a series of lenses, multiple lenses. When I look back at the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, I'm looking at it through eyes that are 2019 eyes, that see what I see here in the modern world with everything that's going on here. And I also see it through not just time, but through place. You know, I happen to be in North Texas in the United States. That is going to affect my perspective differently than if I were in another part of the world. There's also political bias, of course, and I don't think I was really aware of this until I started reading the biography of Richard Nixon and came across one that painted him in incredibly glowing terms, making the case that he may have been one of the top 5 presidents in the whole history of the United States. Now, I've never heard that perspective before because usually he gets bashed. But this historian really brought out his foreign policy acumen. This guy really knew what he was doing regarding foreign policy, and of course got bogged down with the Vietnam War and domestic issues and wasn't able to carry a lot of that stuff out. Well, his issue is more Watergate, but LBJ was certainly Vietnam. But political bias is going to affect how you approach a particular era, a particular act, a particular person within the flow of history. I think in the last 30 years or so, maybe even 40, gender plays a role. So you take a look at a historical character such as Queen Isabella of Spain, and a book that was written in the 1940s, let's say, might have a very different take on her, whereas a modern version would look through a different lens. In fact, it would look through a lens potentially that has been informed by a lot of literature and scholarship from gender and feminist studies. So those new considerations in terms of just looking at society provide a fascinating set of new lenses through which to look at old history. So that's why there's always going to be revisions regarding historical characters, because we just have new eyes. We see things through a different set of perspectives. Sexual orientation is probably one that will continue to grow in terms of literary and historical analysis. So we've got these lenses. When I look at history, I am not unbiased. As much as I would like to just look at the facts and here's what happened, kind of like the Walter Cronkite approach back in the 70s, I guess, 60s potentially. This is the way it was on this particular day, and that claim of just pure objectivity is difficult to find. You've also got historical revisionism, which has always taken place, but again, with the rise of new perspectives, there is an agenda that could be promoted, and it could be promoted in part through rewriting history. Came across an interesting case of that in my study of Henry VII, which we'll get to eventually. I think I have to go from Elizabeth to the end of Will Durant's series, which is pretty much the end of the French Revolution. Then I'll go back and pick up some of the stuff that happened in the more medieval times. But Henry VII, as I learned about on a video I watched last night, became Henry VII when he defeated Richard III in the Battle of Bosworth, which happened, I think, in 1485. I forget the exact date. But on that date, let's just say it was August the 23rd, if that's when it was. What he did in his first act of Parliament is to go back and claim that he had been king the day before the battle. And the day before the battle, he was really nothing more than a long-term refugee that had come into, I believe it was Wales, where the battle was, the Battle of Bosworth, and defeated Richard III after he landed on Wales. I don't know exactly where the battle was. What's the importance of that? Well, if you predate yourself one day prior to that battle, then it makes everyone who fought for Richard III, who legitimately was the King of England on that day, treasonous. So basically, by backdating that, he could charge all these people with treason if he chose to, and he certainly did for some of them. That's probably the most blatant case of strategic historical revisionism that I've ever seen. It's a fascinating story. Another one is Columbus. We celebrated him, at least as I remember growing up in high school. He's the explorer who found America, which is not the case, but anyway. Then I read the book by, I forget the author, but it was about Queen Isabella, a relatively recent book, and looked more in depth at what Columbus did with the natives here in North America, Central America, the Caribbean, that area, and was profoundly not impressed by the way that he treated those indigenous tribes and just the way he treated people in general. So that is a sense of historical revisionism, in a sense of retelling the story in a way that counters prevailing notions. Maybe that doesn't technically qualify as historical revisionism, but it certainly revised my perspective on history. But then, of course, I've got to stop and think, did that author have an agenda to disparage Columbus for contemporary political purposes? to advance a contemporary political agenda? I don't know. And that's where things get a little bit confusing. Now we need to go figure out what that author's background is, probably follow that author on Instagram, on Twitter, and find out what they're tweeting about regarding the contemporary political climate, and just learn what else I could about the background. It's not just a matter of opening a book, whether it's Will Durant or whoever, and just accepting whatever is stated in those books. So there's always spin, always. Even Bill O'Reilly, who was on Fox News for years and championed the no spin zone, has written a number of books on history, and those are all coming from a very conservative perspective. Same thing with Rush Limbaugh's approach to history. Same thing with Glenn Beck's approach to history. Same thing with Paul Johnson, who wrote the other book, or a book on Queen Elizabeth I that I read as part of this project. On the other side, you've got a lot of historical revisionists or historians. On the other side of the spectrum, probably many who are revisionists, but it's another story. From Gore Vidal to whatever. So I think it's important to read on both sides of the aisle, and to say that it's left versus right is really a black and white fallacy, in a sense that there are gradations. There are people who do probably present historical data far more objectively. And I'd be curious. I'd be really curious to know on a spectrum of, let's just say, the treatment of the Tudors, where does that literature fall from the right to the left, if we're going to use those two poles? Where does the bulk of the literature fall? That would be fascinating. If you happen to know that, if you know somebody who's actually done a correlation between political orientations and the literature that they produce, that would be fascinating to explore. And of course, somebody could lean to the left or lean to the right and yet produce a work that we could say is objective. So, who knows? I wrote down a couple tips for myself, actually 4, what to do, because you've got all of this literature that potentially is spinning the issue. What do? You just go to Wikipedia and read what's there? Get the facts, number 1. So actually, I do look at Wikipedia. I find Wikipedia to be incredibly helpful. And I know as a former professor, we were generally encouraged to discourage students from citing Wikipedia in papers, and I get that. But you've also probably seen the study that showed that for every 4 errors in Wikipedia, there were 3 in the Encyclopedia Britannica. And partially that's because I don't know what motivates people to get onto Wikipedia and correct it and update it, but those people are out there. And there have been a lot of instances where people have tweaked an article just to see what would happen, and the public changes it back almost instantly to make it correct. Beyond fascinating. Anyway, get the facts. The second tip is to read spin on all sides. So, if I'm going to study Nixon or study LBJ or study Martin Luther King Jr. or whoever, it's good to read the pro perspective. It's also good to read the con perspective. Number 3, keep an open mind despite all of this. Open to receive new data and to look at the record with fresh eyes. Number 4, follow those voices that seem to make sense to you. After a while, you develop your own views on history, your own views about politics and life. That just comes with age and experience. But don't follow those people blindly. There are some people that I think just make a whole lot of sense to me, but I still need to accept what they have with some caution and reservation. So anyway, my take here at the beginning on historical bias. Let's now get to Queen Elizabeth I and grade her on the framework presented in The Legendary Leadership Challenge, a book that's about 30 years old. I used to use this in a leadership capstone course that I taught. And it's by a couple of authors who looked at effective leadership in organizations and then defined what that was. And when they did that, they came across 5 basic practices. And those are the ones that I'll present here and then grade Elizabeth on. So I'll put these on the screen for you as well. I'll move over here so we can have a little more white space right here. Okay, number 1, model the way. Model the way. The authors define this as, and they've got 2 commitments that go along with each practice, so I'll read these for you. Clarify values by finding your voice and affirming shared values. Okay, I come to the end of Elizabeth's part here. I don't really have the first clue what her values are. And I have been disturbed by her for the last several days as I've tried to figure out who this person is. And I know some authors are like, oh, we know a lot about Elizabeth because of the records that she kept. And yeah, I know when she took her walks and, that type of stuff. I don't really know her heartbeat. I don't know her mind. I don't know her strong, deeply held ideological orientations because she kept a lot of that private, especially when it comes to matters of religion. There's a chance that she was probably a closet atheist despite the active role that she played in shaping religion there in England. So she also used a strategy of vacillation and indecision, and I think a lot of that was probably a reflection of her ambiguity of personal values. Pure speculation. The second commitment under modeling the way is to set the example by aligning actions with shared values. Or again, I don't even really know what her values were, much less how she tried to play a role in emulating those. So, counterexample, Peter the Great, he really wanted to build the Russian Navy. So this guy goes over to the Netherlands and works on the boats as like your regular apprentice and earned a shipbuilder certificate, which for him was one thing in life that he was most proud of, was working with his hands. So for him, his value, I'm going to build that Navy. And he made that happen with his own hands. He set the example. He modeled the way. And I think you can see that in Queen Isabella of Spain in terms of her piousness regarding promoting the Catholic religion. You can see that in Catherine the Great in Russia, in her efforts to modify the legal code. I mean, she sat down for a long time and wrote out the Nakaz, the doctrine of revising the legal code, the whole document, and patiently worked through the process of having it revised. So that was a failure, but that's another story. But when it comes to Elizabeth, I don't see that. I don't see her modeling the way. So I'm giving her an F. Next up is to inspire a shared vision. And Kouzes and Posner define this in terms of the following 2 commitments. To envision the future by imagining exciting and enabling possibilities. I don't see that with her. I saw it in Peter the Great. Let's build St. Petersburg. Let's have access to the sea for the Russian Navy, and let's build St. Petersburg as this amazing city that creates a doorway into the West. And he made that happen in fascinating ways. Another commitment regarding inspiring a shared vision is to enlist others in a common vision by appealing to shared aspirations. And this is one of those elements where a monarch is different than a contemporary leader, a leader which is far more dependent upon public support. Whereas a monarch can just drive things through because they wear the crown, and that's all there is to it. They're the ones holding the global cruciger, the globe with the cross. So I grade Elizabeth as an F for inspiring a shared vision. I just don't see it. My pulse never ran with excitement. I mean, she never built a significant building, from what I understand, in England during her 45-year reign. I mean, you look back to Henry VII, he's got a lot of stuff that he put up. And not to say that buildings are a measure of your effectiveness as a monarch, but it's just interesting to me, no buildings went up, no great castles, no great palaces. I'm sure there were domestic structures and theaters and the like that went up through other ventures, but not directly as a result of her and her shared vision. And I think that's just a metaphor for so much of the rest of her rule. And that goes to number 3, challenge the process. I give her my strongest F. This is an F minus. This is an F in bold. Kouzes and Posner define this as searching for opportunities by seizing the initiative and looking outward for innovative ways to improve. And if you read through Durant, you quickly realize, and it's clearly stated, that Queen Elizabeth worshiped the status quo. And I used that metaphor at the beginning of the series, that she was like that babysitter or mom who basically was telling the kids, settle down. We don't want to, just stop the commotion, stop the fighting. She wanted stability. And anyway, another commitment under challenging the process is to experiment and take risk by constantly generating small wins and learning from experience. And I don't see that she did this. Peter the Great, it was just instilled in his psyche, even when he was a kid. This is just most fascinating to me. He had a group of friends, 600 of them, of which he divided into 2 groups of 300. And those 2 groups were funded by his appeals to the Russian government, and they formed these play armies. And one of them was the Preobrazhensky, which ended up becoming a very significant political force in Russian history, and it all started with his playmates. This was a guy who challenged the process by experimenting and taking risks, by constantly generating small wins and learning from experience. At some point he's like, we need cannons. We need to be able to build forts, or play forts, and destroy those play forts with cannons. And so he would plan these elaborate battles and bring in this artillery and constantly learning, constantly improving, constantly challenging the process. And great leaders certainly do that. Elizabeth, not so much. F. The next category is to enable others to act. The commitments here, fostering collaboration by building trust and facilitating relationships. In fairness, you're probably not going to find a whole lot of monarchs that are going to do well in this category because they don't need to. We don't need to build public trust. The next commitment is to strengthen others by increasing self-determination and developing competence. Self-determination is generally not something that a paranoid monarch wants to be building, because those people might get a desire to overthrow you, as happens in many cases. So I don't really see a heartbeat for her to enable others to act. She generally hired people who already were very talented. Another bit of evidence that goes against her in this category is that she really underfunded projects that she mandated, including the military. Now, you can make a case that you look at the climate of England and the economy at the time. They didn't have a lot of money. So, granted, that also explains why she didn't build castles and palaces and the like. But she was very stingy about royal funds, which is not a completely bad thing, but there wasn't the support, enough support even for the military to do what they needed to do. Finally, encourage the heart. Did she recognize contributions by showing appreciation for individual excellence? I say F. And my primary evidence that I'm going to present to that is in the incredibly low number of people that she knighted during her 45 years. She really withheld those accolades. And one of the things that ticked her off the most is when Essex went to Ireland and on his own knighted a whole bunch of people during his management of that fiasco there in about 1599. So she took great offense to that. I think her notion was, if I limit the amount of people that I knight, then those people who are knighted, it will hold more value. So I get that. It's kind of fighting against inflation from a social standpoint. And finally, the last commitment under encouraging the heart is to celebrate the values and victories by creating a spirit of community. Now, I don't know about the values. There were victories, but I don't see her essential to those. When the English defeated the Spanish Armada, yeah, it happened under her watch. A lot of things happened under her watch. The great growth in literature with Shakespeare and the rest happened under her watch. And as we'll see, there were improvements in art and music and other things too. But I don't see her directly involved in those. In fact, Durant at the end of the chapter here says on page 45, the wisdom of her rule was partly that of her aides. And anyway, I think that's true for a lot of the victories here as well. So anyway, this is my brutal assessment of the reign of Elizabeth the First. Now let me give you another line from Durant, because I think this adds perspective to the devastation that I just wrought here. Durant closes this whole section and the whole chapter by saying, Elizabeth was the greatest ruler that England has ever known. That's what the student's going to say after they get the paper back that has all the F's on it. In this case, Elizabeth, she would bring Durant to me and say, look, right here, the greatest ruler, and yet you give me a stack of F's. Clearly, you must be in the wrong. Well, I think we're looking at two different things. Durant used a key word. She is the greatest ruler. That is different than leadership. Leadership is influence. And it's influence that is functional. So I define a leader as somebody who actually does specific things in order to make a positive influence on the organization and by extension, key publics of that organization. I think there are executive directors of small nonprofit organizations and communities all across the world that are more effective leaders than Queen Elizabeth ever was. I think there are teachers from kindergarten up to graduate school who are more effective leaders. In other words, they function more effectively as influencers regarding the people around them than Queen Elizabeth ever did. I think there are small business owners who are more effective as leaders. And I define that, again, in terms of function. I define that in terms of their ability to model the way. I mean, I worked for a small bookstore in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the owner of the whole thing was often on a stepladder. It was a large enterprise. It wasn't just a small bookstore. There was several bookstores, large distribution, publishing house, blah, blah, blah. Kriegel bookstores, by the way. And the owner, Jim Kriegel, was often on a stepladder replacing fluorescent lights in the bookstore. So in that case, he was modeling the way. He was demonstrating, if you're a worker here, nothing is beneath you, because if you're the head guy, you can do the menial tasks that need to be done. Anyway, those 5 characteristics, or the 5 practices of effective leadership: modeling the way, inspiring a shared vision, challenging the process, enabling others to act, encouraging the heart, are very often done effectively by people who, for the most part, live their lives in the shadows. They're not monarchs. They don't have the coronation ceremony and all that. They're just regular people living life down in the trenches, often not in the spotlight. But I think that very often is the most effective form of leadership. I really define leadership in terms of function, not whether you wear the crown. And I think there is a trend, especially on social media, of people to put the crown of leadership on their own heads. And they do that indirectly by talking about leadership, by, I went to this leadership conference and I attended this leadership event and I got this leadership award for, whatever. My question is for a lot of these people, which I'm not going to ask them directly, but to what extent are you personally modeling the way? To what extent are you inspiring a shared vision? To what extent are you challenging the process? Because I think leadership is functional, and those leaders, those people who do those things effectively, are functioning more strongly as leaders. I'll give you one other quick example. I mentioned Steadfast Baptist Church as a church I don't go to here in Texas, but one that has received a lot of attention nationwide. You can look them up on YouTube and understand why. But they've had a transition in leadership, which is just a fascinating little social experiment that I like to look in on occasionally. So a new leader comes in about 3 weeks ago, maybe 4 weeks ago, and this guy, young guy, probably in his early 30s, is already planning on moving the congregation from West Fort Worth all the way into Arlington. Wow, that's a bold move. That's a Peter the Great type of move. And I'm not saying I condone that, but I am saying it is a very strong example of challenging the process. We've always done the church thing here in this strip mall over here, but I'm going to uproot us and I'm going to move us here. Why? Because of the second part, inspiring a shared vision. We want to reach all of DFW with the gospel. So it's not like we have a shortage of churches here, but we don't have one that is of this. We don't have as many that are of this particular stripe, for sure. Anyway, that concludes the very first chapter on The Age of Reason Begins. And that chapter deals with the great Queen Elizabeth. So we move on to chapter 2 next, which is Merry England. And we get to talk about work, schools, in the home, which, by the way, I recommend the book by Bill Bryson, just called At Home. Fascinating. In fact, there was a section on stairs that I forgot to include on the video regarding the fall of Amy, the wife of Robert Dudley, back on that, probably the first or second video in this whole series. But he talks about stairs. Where did stairs come from? And he talks about the number of people who are injured on stairs. And I forget the exact details, but let me see if it's in my notebook by any chance. And it's probably not. But stuff about the Puritans and then a lot of blank pages. So who knows? But the UK kept very careful statistics on the number of deaths involving people falling down the stairs. It's like huge. It's like a very large number of people, and they stopped doing that somewhere around 2002 or so. But anyway, if you're looking for a book that breaks down, here's the history of the kitchen, here's the living room, here's stairs and porches and basements and all of that, then again, Bill Bryson, fascinating look on history, and some of that will overlap with where we're headed here. And I look forward to exploring that part of the series with you as well. Thanks.